The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged Afghan mountains. As Captain Marcus Hawk Rodriguez adjusted his grip on the A-10 Thunderbolt's controls, the familiar weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders as he prepared for what should have been a routine patrol mission over the Helmand province. Little did he know that this day would test every fiber of his training, courage, and moral compass. 300 miles away, deep in the heart of enemy territory, SEAL Team Alpha was already 12 hours into what had started as a standard reconnaissance mission. Lieutenant Commander Jake "Ghost" Morrison crouched behind a cluster of jagged rocks, his weathered face scanning the horizon through his scope. The intel had been solid. A high-value target was supposed to be in a compound just 2 clicks from their position. But intelligence, as Morrison had learned over 15 years of service, was often as reliable as the weather in Afghanistan. The team of 8 elite operators had infiltrated under cover of darkness, their insertion flawless and silent. They moved like shadows across the unforgiving terrain, each man a lethal instrument honed by years of training and combat experience. Sergeant First Class Tony "Bear" Kowalski, the team's heavy weapons specialist, carried the squad automatic weapon with the same ease most men carried a briefcase. Petty Officer Rodriguez, no relation to the pilot circling miles above, served as the team's medic and secondary sniper, his steady hands capable of both taking life and saving it with equal precision. The mission parameters were clear: locate, observe, and report. No engagement unless absolutely necessary. The target was believed to be a mid-level Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks on coalition supply routes. Standard procedure called for the team to establish overwatch, confirm the target's presence, and call in the coordinates for a surgical strike from above. But the mountains of Afghanistan had a way of making even the best laid plans crumble like ancient stone. As the SEALs approached their observation point, Petty Officer Second Class Mike "Spike" Chen, the team's communications specialist, noticed something that made his blood run cold. The radio chatter he was monitoring wasn't just Taliban fighters discussing routine patrol schedules. The frequencies were alive with coordinated movement, tactical positioning, and worst of all, specific references to American Special Forces in Sector 7. Morrison felt his stomach drop as Chen's urgent whisper crackled through his earpiece. They had been compromised. Whether through faulty intelligence, a turned asset, or simply bad luck, their position was blown. The 8-man team was now the hunted instead of the hunters, and they were about to face odds that would challenge even their extraordinary capabilities. The first shots came from the North Ridge, the distinctive crack of AK-47 rounds splitting the mountain air. Morrison's team immediately took defensive positions, their training taking over as muscle memory guided their movements. The Taliban fighters had chosen their ambush point well. The SEALs were caught in a natural bowl surrounded by elevated positions, with limited cover and even fewer escape routes. "Contact! Contact! Contact!" Morrison barked into his radio as he returned fire toward the muzzle flashes dancing along the ridge line. "Multiple hostiles, northeast and northwest positions. We are taking effective fire." Bear's saw opened up with its characteristic mechanical roar, sending streams of 5.56mm rounds toward the enemy positions. The heavy weapon's sustained fire forced several Taliban fighters to duck behind cover, but Morrison could already see more figures moving along the adjacent ridges. This wasn't a random encounter. It was a well-coordinated trap, and they had walked right into it. Chen worked frantically with his radio equipment, trying to establish contact with their support base. The mountain terrain played havoc with communications, and the nearest friendly forces were over 50 miles away. Even if they could get word out, conventional help would take hours to arrive, time they simply didn't have. The firefight intensified as more enemy fighters joined the battle. Morrison counted at least 30 distinct muzzle flashes, and the number was growing. His team was outnumbered nearly 4-1, possibly more, and their ammunition wouldn't last forever. They needed a miracle, and they needed it fast. Meanwhile, high above the chaos, Captain Rodriguez was finishing his patrol sector when an urgent transmission broke through the static on his emergency frequency. The voice was strained, professional, but carried an undertone of desperation that every combat pilot learned to recognize. Any station, this is Dagger 7 requesting immediate close air support. Grid coordinates follow. Rodriguez felt his pulse quicken as he copied down the coordinates. He knew the area. It was deep in the mountains, far from any known friendly positions. His fuel was running low, and according to the mission briefing, there were no ground operations scheduled in that sector. Standard protocol dictated that he verify the request through proper channels, get clearance from command, and ensure that any close air support was properly coordinated. But the voice on the radio told a different story. This wasn't a planned operation gone slightly wrong. This was a disaster in progress. As Rodriguez banked his aircraft toward the coordinates, his mind raced through the implications. Breaking protocol to respond to an unverified request could end his career. Military aviation was built on rigid chains of command and careful coordination for good reason. Too many friendly fire incidents had taught the services to be cautious about unleashing the devastating firepower of modern aircraft. Yet something in that voice, in the background sounds of gunfire and shouting, told him that 8 Americans were about to die if someone didn't act. The weight of that decision would have crushed lesser men, but Rodriguez had not survived 3 tours in Afghanistan by second-guessing his instincts when lives were on the line. The Thunderbolt's twin engines roared as he pushed the throttles forward, racing toward a confrontation that would test everything he believed about duty, protocol, and the brotherhood that bound all warriors together. Behind him, the safe routes back to base grew more distant with each passing second. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and a choice that would define not just his career, but his entire sense of who he was as a soldier and as a man. In the mountains below, 8 SEALs continued their desperate fight, unaware that salvation was screaming toward them at nearly 400 miles per hour, piloted by a man who was about to risk everything on the faith that sometimes doing the right thing matters more than following the rules. The coordinates led Rodriguez to a scene that looked like something from the depths of hell itself. Smoke and dust clouds marked the impact points of enemy mortars, while muzzle flashes sparked from multiple positions around a central depression where he could just make out the prone figures of the trapped Americans. The tactical situation was clear and desperate. The SEALs were completely surrounded, taking fire from at least 4 different directions and running out of options fast. Rodriguez keyed his radio, his voice cutting through the chaos with the calm authority that came from years of combat flying. Dagger 7, this is Hawkeye 1-6. I have eyes on your position. Can you mark your location with smoke? The relief in Morrison's voice was palpable even through the static and gunfire. Hawkeye 1-6, thank God. Marking position with red smoke now. Be advised, we have multiple enemy positions on all surrounding ridges. Estimate company strength opposition with crew-served weapons. Rodriguez watched as a red smoke grenade bloomed among the rocks where the SEALs had taken cover. The enemy positions were clearly visible now, scattered along 3 ridges in a horseshoe formation that had the Americans trapped in a natural killing ground. Any conventional rescue attempt would be suicide, and even his A-10's fearsome firepower would be limited by the close proximity of friendly forces to the enemy. But Rodriguez hadn't earned his call sign Hawk by being conventional. His eyes traced the terrain below, calculating angles, distances, and the split-second timing that would be required to thread the needle between helping his fellow Americans and avoiding a fratricidal disaster. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, nicknamed the Warthog by those who flew and loved her, was built around one principle: close air support. Her titanium armor could absorb tremendous punishment, while her 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon could chew through enemy positions with devastating efficiency. But the aircraft's real strength lay not in her weapons systems, but in the pilots who flew her, men and women trained to operate in the most dangerous and demanding environment in military aviation. Rodriguez rolled his aircraft into a diving attack run, his finger hovering over the trigger as he lined up on the northern ridge where the heaviest concentration of enemy fire was coming from. The heads-up display painted targeting information across his canopy as he dropped to barely 200 feet above the rocky terrain, so low that he could see individual Taliban fighters scrambling for cover. The GAU-8 erupted in a sound like the world's largest chainsaw. The 30mm depleted uranium rounds tore into the rock and flesh with equal devastation, silencing an entire section of the enemy line in seconds. Rodriguez pulled up hard, banking left to set up for another pass as tracers streaked past his canopy. The enemy had heavy machine guns and possibly shoulder-fired missiles. Staying in one place too long would be fatal. On the ground, Morrison felt hope surge through his chest as he watched the devastating display of American air power. The northern ridge, which had been pouring fire down on them for the past hour, was suddenly quiet. Bodies and equipment were scattered across the rocks where moments before there had been organized resistance. "Hawkeye 1-6, excellent work," Morrison called into his radio. "You've cleared the northern position. We still have heavy contact from the east and south ridges." But Rodriguez was already rolling into his next attack run, this time targeting the eastern position where a Taliban heavy machine gun had been methodically chewing up the rocks around the SEAL's position. The enemy gunner was good. He held his fire until the A-10 was committed to its attack run, then opened up with everything he had. The Warthog shuddered as several heavy rounds found their mark, but her armored construction absorbed the punishment. Rodriguez felt the aircraft respond sluggishly as he pulled out of the dive, and warning lights began flashing on his instrument panel. Hydraulic systems were damaged, and fuel was leaking from at least one tank. The smart thing to do would be to break off the attack and head for base before the damage got worse. Instead, Rodriguez set up for another pass. The eastern ridge position disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris as the GAU-8 worked its terrible magic once again. But as Rodriguez pulled up from the attack, he could see more enemy fighters moving into position. This wasn't just a company-strength force as originally estimated. It was closer to battalion strength, and they were bringing up reinforcements and heavy weapons with disturbing speed. Chen's voice crackled over the radio with news that turned Rodriguez's blood to ice water. "Hawkeye 1-6. Be advised we're picking up radio chatter about shoulder-fired missiles moving to your target area. They're specifically targeting your aircraft." SAMs, surface-to-air missiles. The Taliban had learned from years of fighting coalition forces that controlling the skies meant controlling the battlefield. Shoulder-fired missiles like the SA-7 or Stinger were the great equalizer, capable of bringing down even the most sophisticated aircraft if deployed properly. And Rodriguez was flying straight into their trap. The pilot's training screamed at him to break off the attack. The mission parameters were clear. Close air support should never be attempted in a high-threat SAM environment without proper suppression. His aircraft was already damaged, his fuel was running low, and he was facing an enemy that was specifically prepared to kill him. But below him, 8 Americans were about to die. Rodriguez keyed his radio again, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around him. "Dagger 7, I'm going to need you to concentrate your fire on the south ridge. I'm coming in danger close. Anything closer than 50 meters to your position is going to get hit hard." Morrison understood immediately. Danger close meant that the air strike would be delivered so near to friendly forces that there was a significant risk of casualties from friendly fire. It was a tactic of absolute last resort, used only when the alternative was certain death. "Roger, Hawkeye. We understand danger close. We're marking our perimeter now." The SEALs threw every smoke grenade they had, creating a rough circle of colored smoke around their position. Rodriguez studied the pattern below, calculating the margin for error in his head. At the speed he would be traveling, A mistake of even a few degrees could mean the difference between saving the SEALs and killing them himself. The third attack run was different from the first two. This time, Rodriguez came in even lower, so low that he could see the expressions on the Taliban fighters' faces as they tracked his aircraft with their weapons. The South Ridge was the strongest enemy position, with multiple heavy weapons, and what looked like a mortar team that had been systematically pounding the SEALs' position. The GAU-8 spoke again, its devastating voice echoing off the mountain walls. But this time, as Rodriguez pulled up from the attack, he saw the telltale smoke trail of a shoulder-fired missile streaking toward his aircraft. The A-10 was an older system, but still deadly if it found its mark. Rodriguez threw his aircraft into a violent, evasive maneuver, dumping flares and chaff while pulling G-forces that threatened to tear the damaged Warthog apart. The missile missed by mere yards, close enough that he could feel the heat wash through his canopy. But his evasion had carried him directly over another enemy position, and a second missile was already in the air. Time seemed to slow as Rodriguez watched the missile approach. His aircraft was too damaged to outmaneuver it, and he was too low to outrun it. In that moment, he thought of his wife Maria back home in Colorado, of the daughter he might never see grow up, of the promise he had made to always come home safe. Then he thought of 8 Americans trapped in the rocks below, and he knew that some promises were worth breaking for the sake of others. The missile struck the A-10's left engine, the explosion rocking the aircraft and sending a shower of debris across the mountainside. Warning alarms screamed in the cockpit as hydraulic fluid and fuel sprayed from ruptured lines. The left engine was completely destroyed, and the right engine was running rough, struggling to keep the damaged aircraft airborne. But she was still flying, and Rodriguez still had one more pass left in him. Black smoke poured from Rodriguez's crippled aircraft as he fought to maintain control. Every instinct, every piece of training, every survival mechanism in his body screamed at him to punch out, to pull the ejection handles and trust his parachute to carry him away from the dying machine. His altimeter showed barely 800 feet, perilously low for a safe ejection, but still within the envelope if he acted immediately. Instead, he banked the smoking Warthog back toward the battlefield. On the ground, Morrison watched in horror and awe as the damaged A-10 lined up for another attack run. Smoke and flames trailed behind the aircraft like a funeral shroud, and even from his position in the rocks, he could see that the pilot was flying on borrowed time. The professional soldier in him wanted to call off the attack, to tell the pilot to save himself rather than risk his life for 8 men who were already as good as dead. But the human being in him, the part that had watched 3 of his teammates take bullets in the past hour, stayed silent and let the pilot make his own choice. Rodriguez's hands were steady on the controls despite the chaos surrounding him. Hydraulic fluid had sprayed across his canopy, limiting his visibility, while warning lights painted his instrument panel in angry reds and yellows. The right engine was developing a disturbing vibration that suggested imminent failure, and his fuel gauge showed levels that would barely get him back to base under normal circumstances. These were anything but normal circumstances. The final enemy position was the most dangerous yet, a heavy machine gun nest that had been established in a perfect overwatch position, commanding the entire area where the SEALs were trapped. Taliban fighters had spent the better part of an hour moving ammunition and reinforcements to this position, turning it into a fortress that could pour devastating fire down on the Americans while remaining largely protected from return fire. Rodriguez studied the target through his damaged canopy, calculating angles and distances with the cold precision that had made him one of the most feared close air support pilots in the theater. The position was strong, well defended, and positioned in such a way that a conventional attack run would expose his aircraft to fire from multiple directions. But Rodriguez had stopped thinking conventionally about 30 minutes ago. Instead of the shallow diving attack that military doctrine recommended, he pointed the nose of his aircraft almost straight down and dove toward the enemy position like a guided missile. The maneuver was insane, suicidal, and completely outside the operational parameters of the A-10. It was also the only way to get the angle he needed to destroy the position without risking friendly fire casualties. The GAU-8 cannon erupted one final time, its 30mm rounds tearing into the enemy position with apocalyptic fury. Rock, equipment, and human beings were pulverized under the devastating barrage as Rodriguez held the trigger down until the last possible second. When he finally pulled back on the stick to recover from the dive, he was so low that the aircraft's landing gear almost scraped the rocks. The enemy position simply ceased to exist. But the extreme maneuver had finished what the missile damage had started. The right engine seized with a grinding metallic shriek, leaving Rodriguez flying a powered glider with the aerodynamic properties of a brick. The A-10 was tough, legendary for its ability to absorb punishment and keep flying, but even she had limits. Rodriguez had perhaps 90 seconds of flight time left before physics overcame engineering and brought him down. On the ground, the sudden silence was almost deafening. For the first time in over 2 hours, no enemy fire was raking their position. Morrison cautiously raised his head above the rocks and surveyed the battlefield through his scope. The ridges that had been alive with muzzle flashes and enemy fighters were now silent and still. Bodies and equipment were scattered across the rocky terrain like discarded toys. The pilot had done the impossible. He had broken the back of a battalion-strength enemy force with a single damaged aircraft and sheer force of will. But the cost was becoming apparent as the smoking A-10 struggled to gain altitude. Rodriguez's voice came over the radio, professional and calm despite his desperate situation. "Dagger 7, this is Hawkeye 1-6. Enemy positions neutralized. I am declaring an emergency and attempting to reach minimum safe ejection altitude. Break contact and move to extraction coordinates Lima Charlie 7. Morrison felt his throat tighten as he watched the damaged aircraft climbing slowly into the afternoon sky. The pilot had sacrificed his own safety to save 8 men he had never met, and now he was fighting for his own life with a machine that was more flying wreckage than aircraft. "Hawkeye 1-6, this is Dagger 7, Morrison replied. "That was the finest display of airmanship and courage I have ever witnessed. We will not forget what you did here today." Rodriguez's response was interrupted by static as another system failed aboard his aircraft, but his meaning came through clearly enough. "Just doing my job, Dagger 7. Now get your people home safe." The A-10 disappeared over the ridge, trailing smoke and struggling to maintain altitude. Rodriguez fought the controls as hydraulic failure made the aircraft increasingly difficult to handle. His ejection seat was armed and ready, the altitude was marginal but survivable, and every rational thought in his head told him to punch out before it was too late. But Rodriguez had learned something about himself in the past hour that he had never known before. Sometimes the most important battles were not the ones outlined in mission briefings or tactical manuals. Sometimes they were the personal struggles between what was safe and what was right, between protocol and conscience, between following orders and following your heart. He had chosen to risk everything for 8 strangers, and in doing so, he had discovered reserves of courage and determination that he had never known existed. The cost had been his aircraft, and potentially his career, but the reward was immeasurable. 8 American warriors would go home to their families because one pilot had decided that some things were worth breaking the rules for. The A-10 finally gave up the fight at 1,200 feet above the Afghan mountains. Rodriguez pulled the ejection handles and felt the violent acceleration as the Martin Baker seat rocketed him clear of the dying aircraft. His parachute deployed with a satisfying crack, and he watched his beloved Warthog spiral toward the rocks below, finally succumbing to the damage she had absorbed while saving 8 lives. The search and rescue helicopter found him 40 minutes later, battered but alive, sitting on a rocky outcrop with his survival radio in hand and a smile on his face. The SEALs had already been extracted by a separate aircraft, all 8 men alive and functional, thanks to the actions of a pilot who had risked everything to uphold the Warriors' code that no one gets left behind. The official inquiry would take months to complete. There would be questions about protocol violations, unauthorized weapons release, and failure to follow proper command and control procedures. Rodriguez's career would hang in the balance as senior officers debated whether his actions represented heroism or recklessness. But for 8 Navy SEALs and 1 Air Force pilot, the only judgment that mattered had already been rendered in the mountains of Afghanistan. When faced with an impossible choice between safe adherence to protocol and risking everything to save fellow Americans, Rodriguez had chosen courage over caution, brotherhood over bureaucracy. In the end, that was the only protocol that truly mattered. The unwritten rule that warriors look after their own, regardless of the personal cost. Rodriguez had honored that tradition in the most dramatic way possible, and in doing so, he had reminded everyone involved why they wore the uniform in the first place. The 8 SEALs would return to their families, their missions, and their lives. Rodriguez would eventually return to flying, though the scars from that day would remain with him forever. But the bond forged in those desperate moments above the Afghan mountains would endure for the rest of their lives. A testament to the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when the stakes are high enough and the cause is just. Years later, when people asked Rodriguez why he had violated protocol to save 8 men he had never met, his answer was always the same. Because that's what you do. When Americans are in trouble, you help them. Everything else is just paperwork. It was a simple philosophy, born in the crucible of combat and tested in the fires of moral crisis. But it was also the foundation upon which the finest military traditions were built. The idea that some things are worth fighting for, worth risking everything for, worth dying for if necessary. On that day in the Afghan mountains, Captain Marcus Rodriguez proved that heroes are not born. They are made in moments when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things. His choice to break protocol and dive into the fire would echo through military history as an example of what it truly means to leave no one behind.